Social anxiety generally is something that I tend to view through a fairly simple lens. I struggled with social anxiety for most of my life. Occasionally, I do have moments where it comes back, and I can feel a little bit of the old pricklings of overwhelm in certain situations. The way that I've kind of sorted it in my head is an association between risk, danger, humiliation, judgment, and being seen. Most often, this comes from childhood. So, an environment where you would be told by parents, either get out of my sight. So, then there's a connection made in the child's brain between being seen and negative emotion, or of being heavily judged, persecuted, and humiliated when the child is seen. And then a simple neural association is made between the experience of being perceived, being seen, and enormous feelings of stress and negative emotion. I would think it's possible that people who already have pre-existing social anxiety are potentially a little bit more prone to getting into narcissistically abusive relationships. And I think for the reasons I just gave you, as it would have been in childhood, being in narcissistically abusive relationships can increase social anxiety. So, if a person is already nervous and anxious around being seen, then it makes sense that they would be averse to putting themselves in situations where they are seen. How would that make them vulnerable to narcissistic abuse? One of the major draws and the major mechanisms by which narcissistic abuse plays out is by the narcissist scanning the target for their structure, for their architecture, and particularly their vulnerabilities and their weaknesses, and then doing everything within their power to make that relationship feel very special. So if the narcissist detects that the target feels very unseen and is very uncomfortable with being seen, then it makes sense from their point of view, because it gives them a stronger leverage over the target, to make sure the target feels seen in a way that they never have before in their life, and to make that relationship of being seen unique. So what does that do? It introduces an element of scarcity, such that the victim, when they think about defying the narcissist, defying the narcissist's matrix, fantasy space, they come to the conclusion, seemingly of their own accord, though it's a manipulated conclusion: if I lose this relationship and I lose this person, I will never feel seen again. I will go back to feeling unseen. I will go back to being frightened and invisible and anxious. And when I'm with them, I feel seen and I feel more confident. I feel like the real me. There's no point here debating whether people are born introverted or extroverted, or whether it's genetic or whether it's learned. What we can say is it's a fairly useful category. It's a fairly functional and replicable category across culture, across time, across context. Introversion, extroversion. Introverted people, then, if we continue with that hypothesis, or that hypothesis, would be more vulnerable. People who are introverted, somewhere on the scale for social anxiety, could potentially be more vulnerable to falling prey to the narcissistic shared fantasy space, in which they feel that if they lose this person, they lose the relationship, they'll never get it back again. So that's a very important component. The second part of this would be to say, even if the person was very confident extroverted, used to being seen and quite happy to be seen, and had no issues around social anxiety whatsoever. The experience of being in the relationship with the narcissist across time could induce social anxiety. So I started out by saying a lot of this is formed in childhood, but you're in adulthood now. So how would this form in adulthood? Prolonged, long-term and inescapable abuse, where whether you feel you can't escape or you literally can't escape, it doesn't matter. It's the same subjective experience, essentially. You, across time, when you can't escape, but you're facing confusion, persecution, a lot of hostility, not from a stranger, but from somebody who's very close to you, somebody who ostensibly knows you very well, somebody who ostensibly cares about you very deeply. It's far more traumatic if somebody walks up to you in the street who you don't know and they scream horrible things at you about who you are. That's an unpleasant experience, but it's unlikely to be long lasting. These wounds are not going to be deep. It wouldn't be quote unquote traumatic, I don't think. But if it's coming from somebody who loves you, if it's coming from a parent or a family member or somebody who you're in a romantic relationship with, it cuts so much deeper. This is somebody who exists beyond your boundaries, beyond your outer shield wall, beyond the walls of the fortress. They've come inside and you've let them in there, and they ostensibly, allegedly, know you very well, and they're attacking you in the core of your being. That has more meaning, naturally. That has more impact, that has more pain, that has more effect. And so even if you didn't have social anxiety to begin with, the fact that another adult, you are also an adult, is treating you this way through seeing you and claiming to see things in you that are ugly, that are morally repugnant, that are evil or unacceptable. Often this is pure projective identification. It's coming from them. It's not coming from you. It's not there at all. Then you develop the same core principle to social anxiety, which is I'm now associating strong feelings of risk and danger, negative emotion and pain to the experience of being seen. So I'm saying two things. One, people with pre-existing social anxiety who are probably leaning more towards introversion, they're more likely to get into narcissistically abusive relationships, probably. And even people who don't have those pre-existing issues, they will develop those issues across time through the experience of being inside of the narcissistically abusive relationship. If we accept my first part of the hypothesis, which is the essence of anxiety, social anxiety, is an aversion and a simple neural association between the experience of being seen, of being looked at and judged, of being seen, of being looked at and humiliated, of being seen, of being looked at and being dismissed. So in other words, I'm being seen and it hurts. That then plays out into what we call social anxiety. So I asked you guys the other day in the community area what topics you'd like me to look at next. What scored most highly was getting your life sorted out. The second most highly was how to become more self-assertive. And the third most highly was social anxiety. This Sunday, I'm going to release a new course on overcoming social anxiety, particularly as it pertains to narcissistic abuse. It's going to have elements in there of how I personally overcame social anxiety when I was younger. Some of these methods, they work, but they're not particularly authentic. I'm going to share them with you. They do work, but I'm also then in a later module, I'm going to show you ways that I think are more superior. The essence of the course, if you don't want to get the course, is to alter the belief system around being seen. So if you are walking around believing being seen is very dangerous and leads to pain and negative emotion. Therefore, I don't like to be seen. Therefore, my self-image is as one who is socially anxious. What can play out across time, especially after a narcissistically abusive relationship, is you can quite spontaneously and unconsciously find yourself self-isolating. When we talk about recovery, if a person is in recovery from an emotionally abusive relationship, or indeed in recovery from anything, they have to be taking care of themselves. So you have to be physically taking care of yourself, your food, your exercise, your hydration, your sleep, all of that needs to be needs to have a discipline, a structure, and a hygiene to it, because your body is your mind is your body. If your body is weak, your mind will suffer. If your mind is suffering, it damages the body. So we do everything we can to assist ourselves through the healing process. But social isolation, even for people like me, who probably are quite introverted and draw energy from solitude, have to recognize the deep impact of prolonged periods of social isolation. It's very unlikely that you're going to get better. It's very unlikely that you're going to be able to heal in any long-term meaningful way if you're highly socially isolated. Yes, you can take your time out, you can enjoy your solitude, but part of the structure of the days, the weeks, and months has to include social interaction and contribution to some kind of a community. So I'm going to release that this Sunday, and hopefully that will help people who found either that their social anxiety got worse through the emotionally abusive relationship, or that they'd never had social anxiety before in their lives, but they found that they developed it after the narcissistically abusive relationship had ended. That is what I wanted to say about that. I will now take your questions. Please make them one question long and end in a question mark, and I'll do my best to answer them. The screen will go black for a second. Do not panic. I'm still here. I'm just going to quickly look up a definition of limerence. It's not a term I use often, and I don't want to talk nonsense. Limerence is a state of intense romantic desire or infatuation for someone that is characterized by an involuntary obsession. I'm sure the definition includes negative affect as well. Limerence is based on uncertainty about whether the other person reciprocates the feelings. Negative affect we're looking for, or have I made that up? Intrusive and melancholic thoughts. Mood swings based on whether the other person reciprocates feelings. So the answer is there will be a limerence phase in the narcissistically abusive relationship. So the common given online and all too frequently unquestioned wisdom is that you go through a love bombing phase. And this is drawn straight from cult psychology. And it's functional to draw our understanding of narcissistically abusive relationships from cult psychology. It makes sense, but it doesn't always map precisely. There's definitely idealization that goes on. So the narcissist is idealizing the target is idealizing the narcissist. This is part of the shared fantasy space that is created between the two. So it will be present because it's not an authentic recognition of another human being as a human being. It's the fantasy plus story. Sorry, it's the person plus story, the story that you're creating, the story that they're feeding you to create a fantasy. You're not accepting the person for the reality of who they are. You're propping up the fantasy of who they want to be of who you need them to be and of what the relationship is. So yes, limerence and the early phases of idealization in the narcissistic relationship do map for sure. Oh, we got a lot of questions. Okay. Amanda Liverpool says, I'd sooner be alone than be with the wrong person. Oh, absolutely. Did you go trick-or-treating? I did not. How do you deal with feeling numb after the grief period? Feeling numb is not after the grief period. Feeling numb is part of the grief period. When you've gone from feeling numb to feeling angry, to then processing that anger, then you're coming out of the grief period, where you can accept everything that has happened for what it is and for what has happened. You can forgive yourself for being a part of that, and then you can start to get on with your life. That's when you are post the grief period. Being numb is relatively speaking early on in the grieving process. You might want to consider getting some therapeutic help from a qualified clinician with that, I would say. How does one's inner critic sound after experiencing narcissistic abuse? Where you would have the introjected superego injunction before the relationship, which presumably would be negative, like you're not good enough, you're stupid, you fail at everything that you do. Then that part of you that already existed after the narcissistic relationship would say, look how stupid you are. I can't believe you let that happen. Or, of course, you let this happen to you because you're an idiot, so on and so forth. And then on top of that, there would be the introjected narcissistic voice as well, working in tandem with the pre-existing voice, telling you whatever they want you to believe to be true. You'll never meet anybody like me again. You'll never know this amount of love again. You'll never have as much fun as you did with me ever again. All of that introject is functioning to try and draw you back to the narcissist, even if they don't actually, in reality, want to have contact with you. They would at least want you to want to have contact with them, so they have the power of refusing you. So this is why working on the introject, which is another word, another way of understanding the inner critic, is so very, very important for overcoming narcissistic abuse. I have a course that helps people do that. It's called Narcissistic Matrix Reintegration, and it's available from richardgrannon.com. And the idea behind that is to recognize these negative introjects, to learn how to resist them, and then finally to learn how to integrate and change the introjects so that it is something, so that the thing that it's reminding you of is something positive and has a different objective. It wants good things for you, because the negative introject fundamentally wants to make your life worse and even destroy you. Hi, Richard. What do you think about the transitional target? I don't think anything, because I don't know what that is. This is from psychopath3.com. Psychopaths are especially indifferent with transitional targets, but I don't know what that is. I'm getting federal law enforcement information. I'm not going to speak on this because I don't know what it is. I'm sorry about that, Susie. Kath asks, yes, was isolated through the grief, still in the anger and resentment. How do you get over post-embitterment syndrome? That's all part of the healing process, because if you are actually healing, careful, what I'm becoming aware of, and I don't really quite know what to make of this, is a growing number of people have told me they're in therapy or in coaching to overcome narcissistic abuse, but there doesn't seem to be any useful yardstick by which they can measure their progress. They say that they've done the work, but then, or they'll be like, oh, I've done 3 years of recovery and therapy. I'm like, wow, okay, somebody's been taking your money from you for 3 years. And then they ask me a question and I'm like, I don't know how your therapist and or coach hasn't covered that with you. So you won't have post-traumatic embitterment syndrome if you're actually healing. The reason why people have post-traumatic embitterment syndrome is because they're still living with the cost and the burden of what was done to them. That's what causes the embitterment syndrome. If you're no longer living with the cost and you're no longer living with the burden of what was done to you, and you have emerged a stronger, wiser person, effectively a different person, then you don't have post-traumatic embitterment syndrome. And this, I know for sure, for certain, that this is possible because I've lived that experience. You should get stronger from this. And I don't have post-traumatic embitterment syndrome. I'm not looking at the world through a dark lens, thinking how awful people are. Where are the narcissists? Where are the psychopaths? I better protect myself. I'll never let this happen again. So I know that it's possible. I'm not sure how other people are leading people through narcissistic abuse, but that is the express intent I have for people when they're in narcissistic abuse recovery, is that they emerge from it stronger. Otherwise, like something terrible happens and then you just get on with your life as you were before. There's no payoff. So you don't want to emerge stronger from it. Post-traumatic embitterment syndrome is happening to people who really aren't making major steps in there. So you should be recovering beyond where you were before the relationship started. You should have more credited to you than debited from you by the end of the process. That's the idea. And then there's no post-traumatic embitterment syndrome. It's when you still live with the debt. It's when you live with the consequence. It's when you live with the burden. That's what causes the embitterment. I was isolated, says Granny Jules, with my husband. I'm now still isolated after being away from him. Do you think it's because of the relationship I had with him? I really couldn't say because I don't know anything about your situation. So I don't know what the phrase "I'm now still isolated after being away from him" means to you. And I'm not asking for people to jump in the comments and be like, "Oh, what she means is this." Nobody knows what you mean. It's your experience. It's your subjective experience. So if we were in coaching together and you said to me, I'm now still isolated after being away from him, I would be asking you, what does that mean? Does that mean that you're keeping away from people? If it means that you're keeping away from people, I would respectfully, without telling you, I would ask you. I wouldn't tell you, I would ask you, is that what's happening? If your answer was yes, I would say, why do you think you're doing that? Explore why you think that you're keeping away from people. So if that's what you're asking me, that is how I would answer you with a question. I'm particularly looking for question marks. How would I learn about what a normal interaction with people is if most of the people I let into my life are narcissistic? Um, Again, there's so many ways you could go with that question because I don't know you, I don't know your experience. You know, people will jump to being like, "Oh, I know what she means." But when you do that, you're projecting yourself onto the questioner. And I don't want to do that because if I do that, I'm going to take you where I need to go, not where you need to go. So it's written in a sort of an open-ended way. How do I know what a normal interaction is when everybody in my life is a narcissist? So I would be asking you the question if we were in coaching: is everybody in your life a narcissist? Everybody in your life has narcissistic personality disorder. There's no normal people. And then you would think about it and you would answer me from that point. Mandy asks, is it possible for two narcissists to feed off each other? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I suspect, I've suspected for a few years the most stable form of narcissistic relationship, stable, not stable, durable, longest lasting is between two narcissists who are feeding off each other's delusion. I think that lasts longer. When it's a narcissist and a codependent, the codependent eventually gets worn out and fractures. UG Rose is here moderating. Thank you, UG. Culturally, we over romanticize just clicking. That's dangerous considering how much really needs to be considered when coupling up. Yeah, we're gambling when we couple up. There's an element of gamble there, and the stakes are your time, your body, your emotions, and the way you view love forevermore off into the future. So these are things that we do in the modern world very, very casually and very easily that probably we should take a little bit longer to consider with a bit more seriousness and depth. What are the stages of active healing after leaving the NPD? Um, it's going to be somewhat different person to person. The priorities are going to be different. Typically, though, having said that, in the very first stage, the client will still be in some degree of denial about the amount of abuse and dismissal of their needs that they've actually received. This is typically when they will still report feeling numb. So they'll say to you, if you're coaching or you're a therapist, they'll tell you anecdotes of terrible, horrible, dehumanizing things that have happened with a completely blank expression, or they'll laugh while they tell you. And that's still, if I haven't numbered stages, but that's still very much stage one. So they're still inside the fantasy. Maybe like a foot or a hand is out, but the rest of the being is still inside the fantasy. And the overwhelming, or the over not overwhelming, the overarching message is, yes, this happened. Yes, it's bad, but it's not that bad. The next step after that is when the individual starts to re-individualize away from the merge they've had with the narcissist and the fusing with the narcissist and fusing with the narcissistic fantasy. As they individualize and come back to themselves, then typically is the moment when they get very angry, and then they have a lot of fantasies of revenge. They want to take revenge on their ex. Not always, but frequently. And then you would hope to move to a phase that is a little bit more philosophical. and usually is quite sad. So we go numb, angry, sad. What did we lose? Why did this happen? What happened in my childhood that let me be open to this? What's unhealed in me that caused me at an unconscious level to replay the script? So there's a lot of sadness there. And then you would help the client process the sadness. Then you move into a more sort of philosophical phase, and then you start to get back on with your life. Bia says, well, that's total BS. BS being a belief system. Welsh Pit Bikes asks, whose voice is the inner critic? The inner critic it's not pop psychology, it's still a clinical psychology term, but it's an easier way of saying superego injunctions from introjected people and attitudes and social rules that you've learned. So when you're growing up, you're internalizing people's view of the world. You're internalizing adults' view of the world so you can survive in it. The most negative introjects that you receive, we call or are called the inner critic, but they're actually all they're just introjects. So there's a tape recorder that just plays blindly what significant authoritative figures in your life have told you to be true about who you are and about what life is about. So the inner critic would be the most negative of those recordings. How do you know they are targeting you and going ahead of them and trying to be in the leading position? Are you asking me how do you know when emotional abuse is emotional abuse? I presume you are. So I think one of the major there's two. This is not good psychology. This is bordering on folksy wisdom now, so I'll be careful. If their actions don't match their words, and you see a lot of hypocrisy, if the interaction you have with the person feels very manipulative, if you notice that following the interaction with those persons, you said they, so presumably it's a multiplicity, unless you're talking about the multiplicity of demons that's possessing the one human, you would feel a lot, you'd feel like you're being manipulated, and you'd have a lot of negative emotion in response to that. And I think that's probably enough. I think that's a good starting place. How do you get ahead of them? You really just need to avoid contact with them altogether. These are people who have dedicated their lives to the dark arts, and I certainly wouldn't be trying to beat them at their own game. That would be a mistake. You really need to avoid contact with people like this if you can. How to be more assertive, Astrak. Just change your voice and make it lower and walk around like this. That's a whole course. It would to teach people who are not assertive to be more assertive without them becoming weird automatons who are artificially modeling strange behaviors that don't come from them. They're not from the inside out, but they're from the outside in. Would take me about 3 to 4 hours of course material and a few weeks to a month for people to actually wrap their heads around, to become more authentically assertive. If you model the behaviors of assertive people, then you're a non-assertive person who's artificially modeling somebody else's behavior, and it's probably not going to end very well. So it has to come from the inside out. It has to come from authenticity. Zinit says, I have a pattern of attracting and being attracted to narcissistic people. There must be a part of me that invites that, right? Well, yes. I mean, it's not the weather. It's not just happening to you. There's an interaction there. So the simplest answer is yes. It doesn't mean, however, that there's a part of you that's consciously inviting that. It could be, but it's more likely that there's an unconscious, unresolved part of you that resonates with that kind of a relationship, that finds some comfort or some payoff in that abusive and asymmetric exploitative relationship. I shall take one more question and then I must end because it has been half an hour. Janet Jackson asks, social anxiety is now tenfold after a controlling relationship ended. I'd rather stay in than risk meeting another person who could put me through that again. How can I break this scenario and regain my confidence? I'm very glad that you've asked that question. I'm releasing a course this Sunday that teaches you how to do exactly that. And it's going to be available from richardgrannon.com. Ladies and gents, thank you very much for your time, for your attention. And I hope that was useful. And I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Cheers.